Hello, and welcome to Night Drive Stories. My name's Jack, and I drive the silent highways of the Pacific Northwest long after midnight, picking up those who wander these misty roads. Tonight, let me tell you the story I heard from the stranger I picked up just outside the old truck stop at mile marker 99. He was a tall, gaunt man who seemed to be folded in on himself, as if trying to minimize his presence in the world. He wore the dusty, road-worn clothes of a long-term drifter, but his eyes were what held me. They were the eyes of a man who had seen something he could never unsee, something vast and empty and terrible. They were constantly scanning the horizon, not looking for a destination, but as if searching for a familiar landmark that had been erased. When he got into my car, he didn't bring the usual scent of stale coffee and desperation. He brought with him an aura of profound, unnatural silence, a quiet so deep it felt like it was swallowing the sound of my engine. He said his name was Caleb, and he stared out the window for a long time before he was ready to speak. "You ever get the feeling you're driving through a place that isn't quite finished?" Caleb began, his voice a low, dry rustle, like wind through dead corn stalks in late autumn. He wasn't looking at me, but at the blur of dark, mist-shrouded trees rushing past the passenger window, as if he expected the landscape itself to pixelate and dissolve. Or maybe a place that's being taken apart, deconstructed, piece by piece, like an old building being salvaged before demolition. And you're just passing through on borrowed time before they get around to taking the road away too. I told him I knew the feeling well. It was the heart of why I make these drives. There are stretches of these old highways, especially out here in the deep, unlit woods of the Pacific Northwest, that feel forgotten, not just by people, but by the modern world itself. Places that feel like they're holding their breath, existing in a slightly different time zone from the rest of us. He nodded slowly, a deep, weary, almost ancient understanding in the gesture. "Some places aren't forgotten," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a conspiratorial tone that drew me in immediately. "They're being erased, intentionally, and you have to be careful you don't get erased along with them." We drove in a companionable, charged silence for another 10 or 15 miles. The rain had started, a soft, steady, hypnotic drizzle that slicked the asphalt to a black mirror and made the world outside a smear of dark green and gray. I was navigating a series of winding, forgotten backroads, a shortcut I knew that cut through a particularly dense and unpopulated stretch of national forest. The road was old and poorly maintained. The yellow dividing lines faded to ghostly pale suggestions, the shoulders crumbling away into the forest floor. It was on one of the sharpest and most treacherous of these turns that it happened. My headlights swept across a thick, suffocating bank of old-growth ivy that was consuming a weathered dark green metal signpost. The sign itself was almost completely obscured by the grasping tendrils of the vine, but for a split second, the bright, focused light of my high beams caught it just right. It wasn't a standard highway marker, not a state or county sign. It was a simple, dark, perfectly circular sign, and in its center was a stark, white, sans serif numeral. 0. Below it, a small white arrow pointed down a barely visible, deeply overgrown gravel path that disappeared instantly and completely into the black, dripping, silent woods. I barely registered it, just another piece of forgotten roadside detritus, a ghost of some old, abandoned logging operation. But Caleb saw it, and his reaction was instantaneous, violent, and utterly terrifying. He let out a sharp, choked gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated animal fear. He physically recoiled in his seat, pressing himself hard against the passenger door as if to get as far away from the sign as his seatbelt would allow. "Don't stop," he hissed, his voice suddenly sharp and full of a desperate, panicked urgency that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "Don't even slow down. For the love of God, speed up. Go, now." I was so startled and infected by his raw, primal reaction that I obeyed without thinking, my foot pressing down hard on the accelerator. The car lurched forward. I shot a glance at him. His face was pale, almost luminous in the dim green dashboard light. His eyes were wide with a terror that was completely out of proportion to the sight of an old, forgotten road sign. He was staring into the side mirror, his body twisted in his seat, watching the turnoff, watching the sign for Route 0, until it was swallowed by the darkness and the rain. He didn't relax, not by a single muscle, until we had put several more winding, dark miles between us and that turnoff. What in God's name was that? I finally asked, my own heart now beating a little faster. His fear a contagious thing in the close confines of the car. What was that sign? He took a long, shuddering, ragged breath, the kind a man takes after a near miss with a semi-truck on an icy road. "It's a zero route," he breathed, the words themselves seeming to be distasteful to him, like poison on his tongue. "One of the old ones." I thought, I hoped they'd all been decommissioned, that they'd been allowed to fade. "A zero route?" I asked. "I've never heard of that. Is it a county designation, some kind of service road?" He let out a hollow, bitter, broken laugh that held no humor at all. "No," he said, finally turning to look at me, his eyes full of a terrible first-hand knowledge that made him look 100 years old. "It's not on any county map. It's not on any state map. It's not on any map at all. You won't find it on your GPS. You won't find it on the most detailed topographical survey. As far as the world is concerned, as far as the official consensus reality is concerned, that road doesn't exist, and it's for a very, very good reason." He leaned forward, his expression deadly serious, his eyes locking with mine. "Let me give you a piece of advice, Jack. The most important advice you'll ever get on these night drives. If you ever see a sign like that again, a road that isn't on a map, a path that feels wrong, you don't take it. You don't get curious. You don't stop for a look. You turn around and you drive away as fast as you can. Because taking a road like that isn't a detour. It's a permanent departure. It's a road that leads nowhere. And I mean that in the most literal, absolute, physical, and metaphysical sense of the word." His warning was so strange, so specific, and delivered with such profound, gut-wrenching, bone-deep fear that I knew I was in the presence of a man who was not just telling a story. He was giving a testimony. He was a survivor of a place that, according to him, didn't exist. And I had to know more. I had to know what he had seen down a road that led to nowhere. "I wasn't always like this," Caleb said after a long, heavy silence, gesturing vaguely at his own gaunt frame, at the haunted, hunted look in his eyes, at the fine tremor in his hands. "A ghost in a flannel shirt. I used to be a practical man. A man who believed in blueprints and survey markers and the solid, reassuring, predictable grid of longitude and latitude. I used to believe the world was a thing that could be accurately measured, that it could be mapped and understood and contained within the neat lines of a chart. I know better now. I know the map is a comforting lie we tell ourselves, a child's drawing of a monster to make it seem less scary. The real world, it's full of blank spaces, voids, erasures, and things that are actively trying to tear holes in the paper." He explained his former life, a life that seemed to belong to another man, another more solid era. He hadn't been a standard surveyor for the USGS or a state highway department. He had worked for a nearly defunct, unlisted, and deeply secret government program that had originated during the Great Depression. It was a strange, forgotten branch of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, that had never been officially disbanded, but had simply faded from the books, becoming a kind of institutional ghost. It was called the Federal Cartography Corps. "It wasn't a job you applied for," he explained, his voice a low, nostalgic, almost wistful murmur. "It was a family business, in a strange, unofficial way. My grandfather had worked for the Corps, and his father before him, all the way back to the beginning in the 30s. It was a legacy, a burden, passed down from father to son. When I got out of the Army, with a knack for surveying and a profound distaste for normal civilian life, I was lost. My grandfather made a single quiet phone call. A few weeks later, a man in a black government-issue sedan, a car with no markings and license plates that were just a jumble of numbers, showed up at my small, sad apartment. He didn't give me his name. He didn't ask for a resume. He just offered me a job. Good pay, great benefits, full pension after 20 years. The only catch was that I could never talk about it, not to anyone. I would cease to have a job, in any discussable sense. My official title for tax purposes was Archival Road Maintenance Engineer. It was a lie, of course. We weren't maintaining anything. We were fighting a quiet, losing war. He described the eerie, lonely, deeply strange work of the Corps. His job was to survey and service a series of roads scattered across the most remote and forgotten corners of the country. They were called zero routes, perfectly paved, single-lane asphalt roads, but utterly, unnervingly empty. They had no destinations. They didn't connect towns or lead to landmarks. They just were. A strip of blacktop cutting through a forest or a desert, starting from nothing and ending in nothing, like a scar from a wound that had healed wrong. The work was profoundly solitary, he said. They'd give me my assignment, a set of coordinates for a specific route, delivered by a silent courier. I'd drive out there, sometimes for days, into the deepest parts of the American nowhere. For the duration of the assignment, which could last for weeks, I was completely alone. No radio contact, no satellite phone, nothing. My only companion was the equipment. He described the tools of his trade, and they sounded less like standard surveying equipment and more like the arcane instruments of a mad scientist or a ghost hunter. There was a device that looked like a classic theodolite, the tripod-mounted scope surveyors use to measure angles and distances, but its lenses were made of a strange, dark, smoky quartz, and its dials didn't measure degrees, but what the heavily redacted manual called topological resonance and spatial cohesion. He had another tool, a heavy wheeled device he had to push along the entire length of the road that looked like an old-fashioned real lawnmower, but apparently measured metaphysical density. His job was to spend weeks on these lonely, silent roads, taking meticulous, painstaking readings of the invisible world, cataloging the strange, fluctuating, invisible forces of the land. And then there were the rules, a strict, bizarre, and inviolable set of protocols he had to follow at all times. They were less like safety regulations and more like religious commandments. Rule number 1, he recited, his voice taking on the rote, weary cadence of a man repeating a catechism he has recited 1,000 times. Solitude is paramount. Never bring anyone to a zero route. Never be seen working on a zero route. If a civilian vehicle, a hiker, a hunter, anyone approaches, you pack up your equipment and you disappear into the woods until they are gone. You leave no trace. To them, the road must always appear to be completely abandoned. Rule number 2 was no souvenirs, no contamination. Never remove anything from the immediate vicinity of the road. Not a rock, not a leaf, not a fallen branch. Everything within the road's 20-foot corridor on either side was considered to be unstable, tainted. And rule number 3, he said, his voice dropping, becoming heavy with the weight of this final, most important commandment. The one they drilled into us again and again until it was a part of our DNA, was simple. Never, under any circumstances, drive to the end of the line. The roads were for surveying, for taking readings, not for travel. The terminus point was off limits. Absolutely. That's where the data collection stopped. That's where you packed up your equipment, turned your truck around, and drove away without looking back. He said he'd asked his mentor, an old grizzled chain-smoking Corps veteran named Jebediah, why that last rule was so important. What was at the end of these strange roads? A secret base? A dangerous piece of unshielded equipment? A cliff? Jebediah just took a long, slow drag from his unfiltered cigarette and blew the smoke out in a perfect, melancholy ring, Caleb remembered. Kid, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp from a lifetime of smoke and silence. You don't want to know. Some places, it's best to just leave them be. The road ends because that's where the map ends, and you don't ever want to step off the edge of the map. At the time, I thought he was just being poetic, just an old man trying to add some mystique and importance to a boring, repetitive job. But I was wrong. He wasn't being poetic. He was being horrifyingly, absolutely literal. Caleb had followed the rules for years, a good, unquestioning soldier in a secret, silent war he didn't yet understand. He had driven the lonely roads, taken his strange measurements, and dutifully turned back before the end of the line. But he was about to be assigned to a new route, a place where the rules weren't enough to keep him safe, a place where the map wasn't just ending, but was actively being torn apart by something on the other side. The rain had intensified again, drumming a frantic, almost angry rhythm on the roof of my car. The world outside was a black liquid chaos, and inside, in the dim, quiet space of the vehicle, Caleb's story was weaving a similar kind of storm in my mind. The idea of a secret government agency maintaining roads that weren't on any map was strange enough, a conspiracy theorist's daydream. But the purpose of it all was a gaping, terrifying, existential question mark that I found myself desperate to have answered. For the first few years, I didn't ask too many questions, Caleb continued, his gaze fixed on the frantic, back-and-forth sweep of my windshield wipers, as if their metronomic motion was all that was keeping him anchored to the present. The pay was good, the solitude suited my temperament, and I got to see parts of the country, true wilderness, that most people never do. I just followed the rules. I drove my assigned routes. I took my strange readings. I filed my coded numerical reports. I told myself it was just some forgotten Cold War project, maybe a network of secret, hardened roads for evacuating government officials or moving sensitive materials for clandestine projects. It was a comfortable, logical, boring explanation, and it was completely, utterly wrong. The truth, when it came, had come from Jebediah, his crusty, cynical, world-weary mentor. Jebediah was a lifer, a man who had been with the Federal Cartography Corps since the 1950s, a walking, wheezing, coughing archive of the program's secret history and its slow, sad decline. One long, hot, bug-infested summer, on a joint assignment surveying a particularly troublesome, swampy zero route in the backcountry of Louisiana, Jebediah had finally decided that Caleb was ready to know the real, horrifying truth. We were sitting on the tailgate of his old, beat-up Corps truck at dusk, Caleb recalled, a rare, faint, melancholy smile touching his lips at the memory of his friend. The air was so thick and wet with humidity, you could almost drink it, and the cypress trees dripping with Spanish moss were just black, spooky, gothic shapes against the bruised purple sky. The air was alive with the sound of a million insects. Jebediah lit one of his unfiltered cigarettes, the tip glowing like a tiny, angry star in the gloom, and told me to forget everything I thought I knew about our job. "We're not surveyors, kid," he'd said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that was part of the swamp's own soundscape. "We're janitors. Cosmic janitors. And these roads, they're not roads. They're erasers." Jebediah had then, over the course of several hours and half a pack of cigarettes, explained the true insane purpose of the Federal Cartography Corps and the zero routes they maintained. The roads weren't built to connect places. They were built to erase them. He told Caleb that the founders of the program, back in the desperate, strange days of the 1930s, weren't engineers. They were a bizarre, secret consortium of theoretical physicists from Princeton, esoteric philosophers, and even a few Native American mystics who had been quietly consulted. They were men who understood that the fabric of reality was not as stable, as uniform, or as friendly as it appeared. There were, he said, thin spots in the world, places where the rules were different, where the barrier between our consensus reality and something else was weak, frayed, and porous. He called them glitches, Caleb explained, his voice full of the remembered awe and terror of that humid, revelatory night. Anomalous zones, wounds in the world, places where things didn't quite add up. A stretch of forest in Oregon where the trees grew in unnatural, perfect geometric patterns. A patch of the Arizona desert where compasses would spin wildly and time itself seemed to run at a different, slower speed. A forgotten mining town in Montana where the entire population had vanished overnight without a trace, leaving everything behind. These weren't hauntings, not in the traditional sense of ghosts. They were something much more fundamental. They were places where something was bleeding through from another reality, or where our own reality was starting to unravel, to fray at the edges, like a piece of old, worn-out cloth. The zero routes were the government's secret, desperate, and barely effective solution to this terrifying problem. They were always built directly on top of, or leading directly into, these thin spots. The roads themselves, Jebediah had explained, were built with a special, unique mixture of asphalt, pulverized magnetic lodestone from a specific quarry in North Carolina, quartz dust, and a few other, stranger, classified ingredients that Caleb didn't recognize. The road wasn't just a road, it was a poultice, a bandage, and the strange surveying equipment wasn't just for measuring. The theodolite that measured topological resonance was actually a device that projected a low-frequency, reality-reinforcing hum, a sound that subtly encouraged the universe to remember its own rules. The wheeled device that measured metaphysical density was, in fact, imprinting a complex invisible geometric pattern onto the road surface as it rolled, a sigil of stability. By repeatedly driving the routes year after year, week after week, and using the equipment, Caleb said, his voice a hushed, reverent whisper, we were, in his words, reinforcing the consensus. We were literally paving over the glitch, smoothing out the wrinkle in the map of reality. The constant, repetitive, mundane act of our work, the driving, the measuring, the recording of data, it was a kind of long, slow, grinding ritual that slowly, methodically, erased the anomaly from existence. It made the thin spot thick again. It turned the place where something was profoundly wrong into a place where there was simply nothing. It turned a somewhere into a true nowhere. This was the reason for all the secrecy, for the solitude, for the strange, almost superstitious rules. The work was psychically dangerous. Prolonged exposure to the raw, untamed chaos of the thin spots could affect a person's mind, their own sense of reality, their sanity. And the rule about never going to the end of the line was the most important of all. Jebediah told me that when a zero route is first built, it has a terminus point, a physical place where the road crew just stopped building, Caleb said. But as we do our work, as the erasure proceeds over the years, the road itself begins to shorten, not physically, but conceptually. The nowhere at its end begins to creep backward, swallowing the road itself, unmaking it. The terminus point is the most unstable, most dangerous, most unpredictable part of the entire system. It's the shoreline of the erasure, the place where our reality crumbles into something else. And to go there, that would be like a janitor deliberately stepping into the incinerator just to see if it's working properly. The revelation had recontextualized everything for Caleb. He was no longer a simple bored surveyor. He was a member of a secret, sacred order, a silent janitor of reality, fighting a quiet, endless war against the encroaching chaos and the encroaching nothingness. The job was no longer just lonely and strange. It was terrifyingly, cosmically important. And he had come to accept the immense, crushing weight of it, the sacred duty. But he was about to be given an assignment to a new route, a place where the glitch was more aggressive, more intelligent, more malevolent than any he had ever encountered. A place that wasn't just a thin spot, but a gaping, bleeding wound in the very fabric of the world. Every zero route had its own distinct personality, Caleb said, his gaze turning inward to his own private, haunted map of the United States. The one in the Louisiana swamp always felt sleepy and strange, languid, like the world was having a slow, humid fever dream. The one in the Mojave Desert was sharp and clean, and buzzed with a dry, static energy that made your teeth ache. They were all dangerous in their own ways. They all had their own subtle tricks to unravel your mind if you weren't careful. But they were stable, predictable. We knew their parameters. We knew how they worked. But then they gave me the assignment for Route 012, the Red Creek route. And that one was different. That one was awake. And it was hungry. The assignment had come down from the faceless men at the Corps headquarters as a top priority reactivation. Route 12 had been dormant for over 30 years. The original surveyor, a man from Jebediah's generation, had retired abruptly after his first assignment there, suffering a complete nervous breakdown. For some reason, the file on the place had been marked with a single, cryptic handwritten word in red ink: unstable. But recent satellite telemetry, the kind that didn't measure light or heat but measured the same strange, esoteric energies their own ground equipment did, had shown a massive, alarming spike in anomalous readings from the area. The glitch, whatever it was waking up. It was Caleb's job to go there, assess the situation, and begin the slow, arduous process of erasure again. The route was located deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, near an old, long-abandoned copper mining town called Red Creek. The town itself had a dark, bloody history, a story that was a stain on the local maps. It had been a wild, chaotic boomtown in the late 1800s. And then, in the dead of the winter of 1907, the entire population of over 200 men, women, and children had vanished without a trace, leaving behind half-eaten meals on their tables and fires still burning in their hearths. The event was officially blamed on a sudden severe outbreak of influenza or carbon monoxide poisoning from the mines. But the bodies were never, ever found. The town had been a ghost town ever since, a place the locals shunned. Route 12 began just outside the crumbling ruins of Red Creek and wound its way deep into a box canyon from which there was no other exit. I knew it was different the moment I got there, Caleb told me, a visible shiver running through him that was not from the cold of the night. The silence was wrong. On other routes, the silence was empty, a simple absence of sound. Here, the silence was full. It was a presence. It felt hungry. It was a silence that was actively listening, that was probing at me. And the air, it felt thin, like I was at a much higher altitude than I was. It was hard to breathe. I felt a constant low-grade pressure behind my eyes. He set up his equipment and began his first survey, slowly driving the 10-mile length of the route in his specially equipped reinforced truck. The road itself was in perfect, pristine, impossible condition, as if it had been paved just yesterday, which was the first major impossibility. But the real strangeness, the real horror, was at the edges of the road. The glitch here was far more aggressive, far more overt than anything he had ever encountered before. It was actively creative in its wrongness. He started finding strange, impossible artifacts on the roadside, in the narrow 20-foot corridor of the route's influence, the area his equipment was designed to affect. He found a child's spinning top, exquisitely carved from a dark, heavy, unfamiliar wood, sitting perfectly balanced on a rock. It looked like it was from the 1800s, a toy one of the miners' children might have owned, but it was brand new, without a single scratch or sign of weathering. He found a book, its pages made of a strange, vellum-like material that felt like cured skin, handwritten in a beautiful, flowing, elegant script, but in a language with an alphabet that didn't exist on Earth, a language his brain couldn't process. He found a patch of ground, a perfect 10 by 10 foot square just off the road's shoulder, where sound seemed to completely vanish. He could stand in it and scream at the top of his lungs and hear absolutely nothing, the sound seemingly sucked out of existence, stolen from him. It was like the place was, leaking, he explained, his hands gesturing helplessly, trying to describe the indescribable. It wasn't just our reality that was thin here. It felt like a place where 100 different realities, 100 different timelines, 100 different possibilities, all intersected, all bleeding into each other like watercolors on wet paper. The road wasn't just trying to erase a simple anomaly. It was trying to pave over a multi-dimensional cancerous wound, and it was failing. The wound was growing. After a week of taking readings that were off the charts, readings that his training manual said were theoretically impossible, he had broken protocol and called Jebediah. He had used the emergency satellite phone, the first time he had ever broken radio silence on an assignment. He told his mentor what he was seeing, the impossible artifacts, the aggressive, creative nature of the glitch. Jebediah had gone quiet on the other end of the line for a long time. I remember his exact words, Caleb said, his voice thick with a choking guilt. He just said, after a long sigh, "That route was always a bad one, kid. It's not just a thin spot. It's a hole. It's a drain. Don't engage it. Don't try to be a hero. Pull back to the perimeter and just wait. I'm coming." He was worried. He had a rule. Never face an unknown variable alone. He was coming to help. He was coming to save me. Jebediah had arrived 2 days later, his old beat-up dust-covered core truck rumbling down the road like a tired, loyal old dog. They had set up a base camp together, a few miles from the start of the route, in a place they hoped was safe. For a week, they had worked together, trying to get a handle on the place. Jebediah was deeply, profoundly troubled by the readings. He said the metaphysical density of the area was degrading at an exponential rate. The erasure wasn't a slow, steady process here. The place was actively fighting back, actively unmaking the world around it. One morning, Jebediah had told Caleb to stay at the camp, to collate their data, to recalibrate the density reader. He was going to take a drive down the route by himself. He had a new, more dangerous theory. He was going to try a new, more aggressive calibration on the topological resonance projector. He said he'd be back by lunch. He never came back, Caleb whispered, the pain of the memory raw and fresh and terrible in his voice. I waited all afternoon, all evening, as the sun went down. I tried to call his radio, but there was just static, and then a profound, deep silence. I knew with a certainty that made me sick to my stomach that the road had taken him. The glitch, the hole, it had won. That night, sitting alone in the terrible, listening silence of the Montana wilderness, Caleb knew he had to make a choice. He could follow protocol, call headquarters, report his mentor missing, and retreat like a coward. Or he could break the cardinal rule, the most sacred, most important rule of the Federal Cartography Corps. He could drive to the end of the line. Driven by a desperate, toxic cocktail of fear, loyalty, and a sliver of irrational, insane hope, Caleb made his decision. Protocols be damned. Jebediah was his friend, the closest thing to a father he'd ever had in his lonely life. He couldn't just leave him to be erased, to become another spooky local legend whispered about in hushed tones. He had to know what was at the end of that road. He had to see what had taken his friend. He had to see the face of the enemy. I waited until dawn, Caleb recounted, his voice now a low, flat, traumatized monotone, the voice of a man describing his own execution. I thought foolishly that the daylight might make it less terrifying, that the clean, rational light of the sun would bring some measure of sanity to that insane place. I was wrong. The light made it worse. It revealed the full scope of the wrongness. He got into his heavy-duty corpse truck, its specialized equipment now feeling like useless trinkets, and started down Route 0. The first few miles were unnervingly familiar, the same pristine black asphalt cutting through the Montana forest. He passed the spot where he had found the impossible brand-new antique spinning top, the place where sound itself died. But as he passed the 5-mile marker, the halfway point of the road, the point of no return in his own mind, the world began to change in subtle, then radical, deeply unsettling ways. The color started to drain out of everything, he whispered, his eyes wide with the remembered impossible vision. It wasn't a gradual, gentle fade. It was like I was driving through a photograph that was being systematically, chemically desaturated right before my eyes. The deep, vibrant green of the pines became a sickly gray-green, then a flat, uniform, lifeless gray. The rich, brown, loamy earth of the forest floor turned the color of old, cold ash. The bright, sharp blue of the Montana sky above faded to a washed-out, featureless, milky white, like a cataract over the eye of the world. My own truck, which was a standard Forest Service green, looked gray. The skin on my hands on the steering wheel looked gray. I was driving into a world that had been bled of all its color, all of its vitality, all of its life. Then the sound began to die. The familiar, comforting rumble of his truck's powerful diesel engine grew fainter, more distant, as if it were coming from miles away. The crunch of the heavy tires on the asphalt faded to a soft whisper, then to nothing at all. He was moving. He could feel the vibration, but the world outside the windows was utterly, profoundly silent. No birdsong, no wind, no rustle of leaves. A perfect, profound, dead silence that was not just an absence of sound, but an active, aggressive, sound-swallowing presence. It was the silence of the hollow, he knew, the silence his grandfather had written about in his journals, and he was driving straight into its heart. The final few miles were a journey through a landscape of pure, terrifying abstraction. The trees, now completely gray and colorless, began to lose their texture, their detail. The rough bark, the individual needles, they all blurred and smoothed out. They became simple two-dimensional shapes like cardboard cutouts of trees set up on a stage. The very concept of distance and perspective, the thing he had spent his life measuring, began to break down. The road ahead seemed to stretch on for an impossible, infinite distance, yet he felt like he was standing perfectly still. The world was losing its complexity, its information, being simplified, erased, just as Jebediah had so cryptically described. "And then I saw it," he said, his breath catching in his throat, a hitch in his otherwise monotone narration. The end of the road. It wasn't a barricade, it wasn't a dead-end cliff. It was something so much stranger. The perfect black asphalt just frayed. It crumbled away over the course of about 20 feet into a fine gray featureless sand. It was a shoreline, a beach, and it stretched for maybe 100 yards ahead of my truck. And then it just ended at a perfectly straight, clean line. He stopped the truck, its now completely silent engine still running, and stared out the windshield, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The road had led him to the edge of an ocean, but it was not an ocean of water. It was an ocean of pure, absolute, featureless, infinite white nothingness, a void. It wasn't a bright white light. It was an absence of color, an absence of space, an absence of texture, an absence of information. It was the visual representation of the concept of gone. He was looking at the physical manifestation of the hollow. He had reached the place where the map didn't just end, but where the very concept of geography, of place, of existence had ceased to be. He sat there for a long time, paralyzed, his mind shattered by the sheer, magnificent, cosmic horror of the sight, the shoreline of the void. This was the terminus point. This was the incinerator. This was the place they were never, ever supposed to go. And then, his gaze, which had been locked on the impossible horizon, drifted to the left. And he saw it. Jebediah's truck. It was parked about 50 yards down the gray, silent, sandy shoreline. Its familiar, dented, mud-splattered form looking stark and terribly, tragically real against the unreal backdrop of the white void. The driver's side door was hanging open as if he had just stepped out. Relief, insane, irrational, and utterly foolish, washed over Caleb for a split second. Jebediah was here. He was alive. He was okay. He got out of his own truck, his legs unsteady, his boots making no sound at all on the strange, silent, frictionless sand. The air here was thin and cold, and had no smell. He called out his mentor's name, a name he had said 1,000 times. Jebediah. The sound died the instant it left his lips, swallowed by the immense, oppressive silence of the void. He heard nothing. He felt the word leave his throat, but it never reached his own ears. And then, a figure stepped out from behind Jebediah's truck, and Caleb's fleeting, foolish hope turned into a scream that he couldn't hear. It was Jebediah, but it wasn't. The figure that stood beside the silent gray truck was a perfect, three-dimensional photorealistic replica of Jebediah. It wore his familiar, worn, grease-stained denim workshirt, his dusty, scuffed-up boots, his faded, sweat-stained baseball cap. It had his grizzled, weary, deeply lined face, his stooped shoulders from a lifetime of leaning over survey equipment, the slight, almost imperceptible limp in his left leg from an old injury. It was, to all outward appearances, his friend and mentor, standing there on that terrible, impossible shoreline. But Caleb knew, with a certainty that went deeper than his own bones, a certainty that was cold and absolute and sharp as a shard of glass in his heart, that it was not him. "Its eyes," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. His own eyes screwed shut now as if to block out the memory, a memory he had clearly replayed 1,000,000 times in the dark. That's how I knew. That's how I was sure. Jebediah had these warm, kind, sharp blue eyes, full of a cynical humor and a deep, hidden sadness and a lifetime of hard-won, painful wisdom. They were alive. This thing, its eyes were the same pale blue color, but they were just surfaces. They were perfect, glossy, and utterly empty, like the pale blue glass eyes of a taxidermied animal or a doll. There was nothing behind them. No thought, no feeling, no recognition, no soul. Just a perfect, hollow, vacant mimicry of a living thing. The thing that wore Jebediah's face turned its head and looked at Caleb. It didn't seem surprised to see him. Its movements were subtly, unnervingly wrong, too smooth, too fluid, lacking the small, imperfect hitches and hesitations of a real human being. It was like watching a flawless, high-resolution, computer-generated animation of a man, an animation that had gotten all the details right but had missed the essential spark of life. It smiled, a perfect replica of Jebediah's familiar, crooked, cigarette-stained grin. But the smile was a mechanical gesture. It didn't reach its empty, glassy eyes. The smile was a mask, and behind it was a profound, cosmic, and terrifying indifference. It raised a hand, its own familiar, calloused hand, and beckoned to him, a slow, calm, welcoming gesture. "Come on over, kid. The work is done. Time to rest." The gesture was perfect, but it was silent. Caleb knew instinctively that this thing was not capable of speech. It didn't need to be. Its intentions, its purpose, its terrible invitation were being projected directly into his mind, not as words, not as a voice, but as pure, raw concepts, as feelings. Calm, peace, quiet, rest. No more questions, no more struggle, no more pain. Just stop, join me, be still. It was an echo, Caleb explained, the term one he had found scrawled in the margins of one of Jebediah's older, more frantic, nearly incoherent journals. That's what the Corps called them. The things that sometimes came back. When the erasure process was incomplete, when a person was taken by a particularly aggressive glitch, sometimes the hollow would keep a copy, a print, a hollowed-out, silent replica of the person it had consumed, like a snake shedding its skin. An echo of a person with all the form but none of the substance, and it was offering me the same peace, the same emptiness, the same erasure. He stood there on the gray, silent sand, 50 yards from this perfect, terrible effigy of his friend, and he felt the pull of the void. It was a seductive, alluring, almost irresistible thing. The promise of an end to all fear, all pain, all struggle, all memory. The promise of perfect, absolute silence. His mind, battered and terrified and exhausted, was tempted to just give in, to walk over to his friend, to take his hand, and to step off the edge of the world into the clean, white, empty, uncomplicated peace of the void. But some small, stubborn, terrified part of him, the part that was still Caleb, the part that still loved the messy, noisy, complicated, painful, real world, screamed a silent, defiant no. He didn't say the word aloud. He couldn't. He just thought it, with all the force of his being, and the echo that wore Jebediah's face registered his refusal instantly. Its smile didn't falter, not for a second, but its empty eyes seemed to focus on him, not with anger or frustration, but with a cold, clinical, analytical curiosity. It felt, Caleb said, like the void itself was taking his picture, making a copy, taking a print of him for its vast, silent collection. He felt a strange, cold, tingling sensation wash over him, from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, as if he had been scanned by some invisible, high-resolution light. And then the echo turned, its duty done, got back into Jebediah's truck, and with no sound at all drove the truck forward, off the gray sandy shoreline, and into the infinite white void, where it simply, utterly, and completely disappeared from existence. Caleb had turned and run. He had scrambled back to his truck, his mind a symphony of pure, screaming terror, and he had driven. He had driven back through the gray, silent, simplified world, back into the world of color and sound and life, not stopping until his truck ran out of gas hundreds of miles away from that terrible, hidden, hungry road. But I didn't truly escape, he told me, his story finally reaching its grim, desolate conclusion in the here and now. I got away from the place, but it got a piece of me. It has a copy now, a template, an echo in waiting. He explained that he has been on the run ever since, a permanent drifter on the loneliest roads he can find. He can't stay in one place for too long. He can't form attachments. He can't look in mirrors or dark reflective windows for more than a second. He abandoned his truck, his equipment, his old life. He is a ghost, haunted by a ghost of himself. "Sometimes," he whispered, his eyes finally looking at his own faint, ghostly reflection in my passenger window, his face a mask of utter, soul-deep horror. "When I'm tired, when my guard is down, when I'm not paying close enough attention, I'll catch a glimpse of it, my reflection. And for a split second, it's not me. It's the echo, my echo. Its eyes are empty, And it's always smiling, that same terrible, calm, patient, welcoming smile. It's looking for me. From its place in the nowhere, it's trying to find me in the somewhere. It's trying to find a way back, to find its original, to trade places, to bring me home to the silence. He trailed off, his terrible story finished. He had no answers, no hope, just the certainty that he was being hunted by a piece of the void that was wearing his own face. I dropped him off at a desolate 24-hour gas station an hour later. He thanked me for the ride and for listening. He said that telling the story helped, that it made his own reflection feel a little more solid, a little more real for a while. He got out of the car and walked into the harsh, buzzing, fluorescent glare of the station, a lonely man running from his own shadow. As I drove away, back into the comforting darkness, I couldn't shake the chill of his final, unspoken implication. That stories, like the zero routes, could be a kind of terraforming. That by telling his story, by placing the indelible image of his echo in my mind, he had somehow made me a part of his haunted map. And I wondered, as I drove down that long, dark, lonely road, how many other hollowed-out copies of lost souls were out there, standing silently on the shorelines of forgotten places, just waiting patiently for a familiar face to come driving down a road that leads nowhere.